Thank you, Sari and Fred. I'm a journalist, which definitely makes me one of those ordinary people who sort of stumbled into preservation as a topic of the center of my interest, along with many other issues in urbanism and design. And it's interesting because as a journalist, obviously, I'm a skeptic. And so when Fred quite rightly says that preservation has now become mainstream, I start to think, that makes it a target. So, there's something fundamentally paradoxical about preservation, and that's what I want to talk about today. Because let's face it, you can't preserve a living thing, or anything really. I mean, you can't halt its decay or prevent its destruction without at the same time transforming it completely. We know this intuitively when we think about preserving a cucumber in brine and producing a pickle. We know it when we're talking about pumping a pretty face full of Botox and producing Meg Ryan. Well, buildings, streets, and cities too are living, complex entities. And whether we like it or not, protecting their physical integrity usually means changing their character, even denaturing their soul. The entrepreneur owner who fixes up an old warehouse for a small distillery, the nonprofit that recycles an abandoned school into affordable housing, the activist who persuades the authorities to create a historic district. Each of these local decisions doesn't just preserve the buildings or create an environment for those activities, but it also helps shape the future of a city. So it used to be that preservationists could plausibly see themselves as defenders of architectural heritage against the amnesiac culture of money. Certainly that's how violinist Isaac Stern thought of himself in 1960 when he campaigned to save Carnegie Hall from being demolished to make way for an office building. He was right. But since then, we've learned that preservation, too, can be an instrument of capital and gentrification. I'm not here to fulminate against preservation, quite the opposite. I'm an enthusiastic defender of historical memory. But I think that we preservationists, accidental or professional, need to be alert to the complexities and consequences of what we do and to take responsibility for them. They're not somebody else's problem. So I'd like to discuss three examples, three more or less straight pedestrian thoroughfares in three different cities, each the object of a preservation effort by various combinations of government, activists, citizens, and investors, each with quite different results. Let's start in Rome. This is Via dei Fori Imperiali, which means the street of the imperial fora. It connects the Colosseum and Piazza Venezia. It was built in 1932 as a multi-lane boulevard driving through central Rome. At times, the traffic could get out of control. In August of last year, the new mayor, Ignazio Marino, closed Via dei Fori Imperiali to traffic. Simple as that. Okay, not as simple as that because buses could get through, taxis, diplomatic vehicles, anybody who slipped by while the cops weren't looking. This is Rome, but still, it was semi-pedestrianized. The move counts as a form of preservation because the road cuts right through the Roman Forum, which for 90 years has been rapidly blackening and flaking away thanks to the fumes from thousands of vehicles that pass by every hour. Eliminating that traffic, even incompletely, will help slow that decay. Marino has been pushing to make the change permanent and to extend the pedestrian zone to surround the major archaeological sites, the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, and the Forum. He's even talking about a glass-sided streetcar that would ferry tourists up and down the avenue. You can imagine how popular that is with the Romans. To understand the implications of that move, let's pan away before zooming back in. Visitors who return to Rome after many years often have the reassuring feeling that nothing has changed. The same churches line the same squares, the same kids appear to be hanging out on the same motorbikes in front of the same cafes, although in fact they are presumably the next generation of loafers. But that impression of permanence is actually a relatively new phenomenon. Rome was shaped over 2,000 years by constant change. It was built, sacked, patched up, allowed to decline, regularly subjected to large-scale urban planning. Everywhere you go in the old city, you can see each generation's irreverence for the one that came before. Here's the Theater of Marcellus, which Julius Caesar ordered up, though it was completed after his death, and eventually allowed to fall apart. In the 16th century, the Savelli family erected a palace on top of it, essentially a set of residential skyboxes designed by Baldassare Peruzzi. Shopkeepers colonized the arcades, homes sprang up on what was once the stage, and the Jewish ghetto grew up right up against its walls. In the 1920s, the government launched a series of excavations which involved clearing away many of those historical incrustations, including medieval churches, apartment houses that interfered with the sightlines. You know who was responsible for that round of purifying destruction? Benito Mussolini. If the name doesn't ring a bell, just think of him as the Robert Moses of Rome. Mussolini was also the creator of Via dei Fori Imperiali, the street we're talking about, which, as I said, opened in 1932 with a military parade. Mussolini had great reverence for ancient ruins and total disdain for dwellings that were just really old. He plowed through entire neighborhoods in order to connect the relics of imperial Rome with the seat of his own empire at Piazza Venezia. In fact, he called what we now call Via dei Fori Imperiali, he called Via dell'Impero, Street of the Empire. The name was changed after World War II. Now, Mussolini took such a personal interest in that project that rather than just showing up to turn the ceremonial first spadeful of soil, he climbed up to the roof of a condemned building, grabbed a pick, and started demolishing it himself by hand. The violence of Mussolini's planning spree so repulsed subsequent generations that building anything in the central city became effectively taboo. After World War II, Rome was spiffed up and frozen. It stopped developing. The spirit of preservation and the ubiquity of buried artifacts became so dominant that still today, every proposal to widen a sidewalk, to build an underground parking garage is mired in controversy and stalled for years. Even in the outskirts, the city plans megaprojects, holds design competitions, sometimes even begins construction, and then turns off the money, turning a construction site into an archaeological zone. This is a project designed by Santiago Calatrava. It's a sports facility on the edge of Rome that has gotten to this stage that you see and no further. In the center, Rome preserves its ruins. At the edge, new building projects go straight from vision to ruin without ever passing completion. Into this perpetual status quo rides the new administration. The mayor, Ignazio Marino, is oriented towards an American mentality. He was a liver transplant surgeon who lived for years in Philadelphia, biking to the hospital where he worked. Now he bikes to City Hall. I spoke to Mayor Marino recently, and it's interesting that he perceives Rome as less preservation-minded than, say, New York. The pedestrianization of Via dei Fori Imperiali, which is one of his signature projects, he told me, is very popular abroad, very unpopular in downtown Rome. This is Marino talking. Romans were used to being able to drive right through the largest archaeological park in the world, but we have to manage our heritage responsibly. I'm quite sure that if the Colosseum were in Manhattan, New Yorkers would not treat it as a traffic island. A few months ago, we started a renovation, and already we're able to see the true color of the Colosseum. My generation never saw that. Here is what's astounding. The most radical urban planning move in decades consists of eliminating traffic from a traffic artery created by the city's last radical urban planner. Marino is undoing Mussolini by doing very little, with a few traffic cones. On the surface, this seems like a great idea, and maybe one day it will be, but let's look at the immediate consequences. If you walk from the Colosseum, which is A, to, say, the Pantheon, the walk takes you just over a mile. And that straight line takes you right down Via dei Fori Imperiali. Going by car takes longer. You have your choice of elaborate detours, and the most logical route is closer to about 3 miles long. That's 3 times as much exhaust per car, more if you count the snarls that have resulted from the detours. In the long run, it's possible that traffic will fall far enough to offset the change. But for now, in order to protect the Forum, Marino has created even more toxic fumes and then just moved them around. It's not so great for pedestrians either. The idea was that Via dei Fori Imperiali was going to be a great new after-dinner stroll, a passeggiata. The problem is that there's nothing there to attract people in the evening. There are archaeological sites, but no bars, no restaurants, nothing. The pedestrianization of this one street exacerbates a completely different problem, too. So let's talk about that. One of the pleasures of Rome years ago was its economic diversity. This is central Rome, this is Campo dei Fiori. You had outdoor vegetable markets in front of greasy moped repair shops, next to fancy antique stores. You had working class and wealthy people living next door to each other. This was what Rome was like when I was growing up. Today, some families manage to hang on to rent-controlled apartments, but for the most part, real estate in the historic center is surreally expensive. Does that sound familiar? As a result, tourists see a city preserved in amber. Over the years, an absolutist spirit of preservation has hardened what was once an organic, tumble-down city into a frozen zone of luxury. Meanwhile, the action has moved to the outskirts, to Ostiense, for instance, a once industrial neighborhood that has become youthful and vibrant, full of bars and restaurants. This situation predates Marino, but here's the thing. Severing the vehicular connection between Rome's outlying areas, Ostiense is just to the south of the Colosseum, between those areas and its historic center, winds up exaggerating the contrast between them. Tourists at the center, locals at the edge. Rome has an extensive public transit system, but it's cumbersome, and Romans tend to go wherever their cars can take them, which is places like this. Increasingly, that means that if they can avoid the center, they do. Instead, on weekends, they head for bright, shiny shopping malls in the periphery. So it's too soon to know for sure, but in closing Via dei Fori Imperiali to traffic, Marino may have produced a series of effects diametrically opposed to his intentions. More traffic, more car dependence, and the creeping suburbanization of Italian life. Stay tuned. We'll see how it works out. So let's change continents and cultures and head to Mexico City. We're standing in the middle of the Zócalo, the vast piazza that's been at the city's heart since well before the Spaniards showed up. So from here we have a choice. We can head into narrow streets where sidewalk vendors spill into traffic lanes hawking pirated DVDs and plastic gewgaws, or we can stroll west down the freshly washed, car-free Avenida Francisco Madero toward a horizon of glittering skyscrapers. Let's do that for now. This part of the historic core has been transformed and preserved in the past 20-odd years. 16th century cloisters have been restored to luminous tranquility. Crooked bell towers have been straightened, more or less. And the streets have been made safer by cops with automatic weapons and bulletproof vests. It wasn't always this way. Starting at mid-century, the city, Mexico City, which had a population of roughly 3 million at the middle of the century, launched into decades of breathless expansion, voraciously swallowing up nearby towns. As it expanded, Mexico City hollowed out, like so many urban centers in the United States. In the 1940s, the government froze rents, effectively sending the real estate market into a politically induced coma. Landlords gave up trying to make a profit, and since there was no way to unload a worthless palacio, instead let their properties turn back to dust. Affluent residents abandoned their historic homes in the centro, preferring gated enclaves in the outskirts with fences, guards, and gardeners. The middle class would grudgingly drive in for a show or an event and then beat it right back to the hills. So the Centro Histórico had already been crumbling for decades when a massive earthquake brutalized Mexico City in 1985. In the Centro, palaces moldered, roofs leaked, floors buckled, ornate stonework flaked away. At sunset, when offices and museums closed, the area became a ghost town. Poor families holed up in the few apartments that remained occupied. The level of street crime was limited mostly by an absence of victims. But just as the historic center's obsolescence seemed permanent, it began to be reversed. UNESCO declared the center a World Heritage Site, and the government began shoring up monuments. Then, in 2001, the telecom billionaire Carlos Slim Elu began an open-ended project to revitalize the center. Not just as a collection of monuments, but as a vibrant downtown. He was interested in city building. He bought up and fixed up old buildings by the dozen and erected new towers to the west. And this old section and the new section were linked. Avenida Madero became a pedestrian thoroughfare. It was the spine of Slim's new centro, so cars were cleared out. Early in the morning, it has a bleach and sunlight smell. Shopkeepers douse the sidewalks, and street sweepers work over the new pavers of the pedestrian artery. It's got new lighting, new pavers. Stroll down from the Zócalo and you come to the Casa de los Azulejos, a joyously tile-covered palace that a century ago housed the Jockey Club, the meeting place of the city's nabobs. Now, it's Sanborn's, Slim's department store cafe, where waiters in bright traditional dress glide across the polychrome floors. Judged by its own ambitions, the operation of rescue of the centro has been staggeringly successful. Crime has fallen, tourism is up, and the streets no longer go dead after dark. The rescue, the rescate, has yielded a bourgeois revolution. A city center reclaimed for office workers, tourists, long-time holdouts, young couples with dogs, children, not so much. Every day it feels a little more wholesome, a little less jagged, a little more global. The sober, stony-faced palace of the Counts of Miravalle has been revived into the exuberant industrial chic downtown hotel. Its courtyard is filled with boutiques and restaurants, and one interior wall is covered with a great vertical lawn. These days, announcing at a dinner party that you live in the centro no longer gets you expressions of puzzlement or pity. Best of all, since so many of the buildings were once vacant, the center appears to be experiencing a rare urban event, gentrification without displacement. But it takes just a few extra steps from the Zócalo to find the limits of this rosy revitalization. A couple of blocks north of the Zócalo, you plunge into the churning neighborhood of Tepito. This Barrio Bravo, or District of Defiance, is a preservationist nightmare. Colonial-era buildings buckle and peel. Carved stone pediments are losing the battle for attention to gaudy plastic signs. Electric pylons look like maypoles, ribboned with jury-rigged lines that carry stolen current and regularly ignite fires. Here and there, a room looks like it's been snapped off, though whether by fire, earthquake, or pillage, it's difficult to know. The basic unit of habitation is the vecindad, a collection of rickety tenements crammed around a series of courtyards, rarely as empty as you see it in this picture. It's the living arrangement that gave birth to the Mexico City rock band, Maldita Vecindad. This is the kind of vital but ruthless neighborhood that exists in virtually every city. And that horrifies urban planners, horrified people like Mussolini and Robert Moses. They wanted areas like this gone. In Mexico City, periodically, the authorities take half-hearted stabs at cleaning up the centro's dingier districts. They invited Rudy Giuliani to crack crime. They float grandiose plans to rebuild the sprawling market of La Merced. More concerted attempts to impose order and renovate Tepito would result in ferocious resistance, however. So these two adjoining parts of the historic center simultaneously coexist and pull apart. One, the rescued part, the revived part, is increasingly dominated by bars and brand names. The other, Tepito, is a bastion of apparent chaos and physical deterioration. In one corner, renovating old buildings has meant giving them fresh life. In others, preserving the architecture would likely mean suppressing a society that's informal and troubled, but also vibrant and proud. So here's a very real philosophical question. Is it nobler in the mind to fix up buildings and erode a fragile society at the same time, however neglected and frightening? Or let the people take care of themselves and accept the risk that every once in a while an upper floor will just collapse? Pumping in cash to these neighborhoods, for whatever reason, whether it's to fix up social housing, to widen a sidewalk, to build a movie theater, to open a restaurant, what that does is inject an addictive dose of prosperity into a neighborhood that has structured itself around deprivation and rejects interference. Mexico City dramatizes the paradox we've been talking about. Bringing a decrepit building back to its old self means reshaping everything around it. So finally, we come home to New York, and our third pedestrian thoroughfare, our final example of transformative preservation, the Highline, which, for those of you who are not from New York, runs from the meatpacking district at Gansevoort Street up the west side through West Chelsea to the rail yards at West 30th. I'd like to tell you a little story about this area, about the meatpacking district, which I heard from a friend of mine. His grandfather was a wholesale butcher in the meat market, which was what the meatpacking district used to be called. He worked there for 55 years. At dawn in the early 1970s, when my friend was a small boy, he climbed into his grandfather's truck at the western end of 14th Street, where beneath the elevated highway, which no longer exists, the city petered out in parking lots and crumbling piers. Cobblestones were slick with animal blood and offal. From time to time, an elevated freight train shuddered overhead, whining to a halt at the Gansevoort Street terminal. Towards dawn, workers began hosing down the street so that when daylight finally arrived at full strength, the neighborhood would be fresh and virginal again. At that moment, my friend saw a man emerge from a door. He wasn't a butcher. Instead of a blood-stained apron, he was dressed in black leather. One detail stuck in the boy's mind for decades: the glint of morning light on the man's earring. It was a shocking grace note of glamour. It would be years before that boy understood the double meaning in the area's name, the meat market, or that some men were drawn to the nocturnal traffic in live flesh rather than dead. Later, my friend saw the area in all its incarnations. He came for the gay clubs in the 1980s, worked at a cultural institution in the 1990s, moved there in the 2000s, where he was appointed to the community board, where he now serves. Let's get back to the Highline itself. From the time the freight line, serving the warehouses and wholesale butchers of West Chelsea, stopped running in the 1980s, from then until the end of the 20th century, property owners in that area saw that elevated line as a rusting hunk of obsolete infrastructure. It was blight, plain and simple, a barrier to development and therefore to making money. Then in the late 1990s, along came Joshua David and Robert Hammond, two young enthusiasts who had only the faintest idea what forces they were about to unleash. With the naivete of youth, they thought it would be nice if the elevated train line were turned into a park. In a sense, the Highline already was a park. Even though it was gated, abandoned, and out of bounds, people did go up there, and one person who did was the photographer Joel Sternfeld. David and Hammond used his images to publicize the romantic strip of wilderness that had developed up there. From the get-go, they understood the irony, and if ever there were accidental preservationists, it was these two. They understood the irony that in order to preserve this strangely secluded place in the middle of New York, they would first have to destroy it. David and Hammond had two important and connected insights that helped persuade doubters and that shaped the future of New York. The first was that once it was designed, planned, rebuilt, and opened, the Highline would become a unique public amenity right alongside new residential buildings, and that would generate real estate value. The idea that preserving this infrastructure would generate real estate value was the key to making it happen. The second insight was that because the same structure had locked up development for so long, and so many buildable sites remained, the historical artifact would run through a changing urban landscape. That green seam, that object of their preservation, would stay the same, while everything around it would evolve. So while the Highline was getting going, the meat market was evolving into the meat packing district. In 1985, a French restaurateur named Florent Morellet opened up an all-night bistro on Gansevoort Street. The restaurant, Florent, quickly became a magnet for a big range of the people who lived and worked in the neighborhood, mostly worked, transvestite hookers, butchers, local eccentrics, celebrities, suburban curiosity seekers, tourists, overstimulated clubbers who would come to eat off their activities at 4 o'clock in the morning. Its anarchic spirit, which, by the way, was beautifully captured in the documentary Florent, Queen of the Meat Market. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. Embodied the sense that the district was an urban frontier. But of course, the area was changing, thanks in large part to Florent's fame. The butchers were gradually being evicted, art galleries were moving in, and real estate prices started rising. At the same time, AIDS put a damper on the raucous gay nightlife that centered on sex clubs like Anvil, Hellfire, and Manhole. Morellet, who was an energetic activist for gay rights, fought to preserve the meat market, to protect its iron awnings and squat brick boxes from too many condos and shiny boutiques. And one of the things you can see in this is that even when he opened the restaurant, he preserved the sign of its predecessor, the R&L restaurant, and just put at least most of his name in the window. So thanks in large part to his powers of persuasion, the Landmarks and Preservation Commission designated the area as historic district. The irony is both delicious and tragic, as you can see in this before and after pair of pictures by Brian Rose. 18 years after opening his anti-establishment establishment on the fringes of civilized Manhattan, a place that raised its middle finger to bourgeois conventionality, the restaurateur Florent Morellet suddenly found himself wanting to slow down change. It's natural human behavior, the desire to upset the old order when you're young and then protect it as you age. But it wasn't hard to see that enshrining the meat market as the meatpacking district would only accelerate the change he had started and was now trying to stall. Today, the reclaimed ruin of the Highline has turned into a walkway through a crystal canyon. This is the narrowest section from 19th to 23rd Streets, and it resembles the moving sidewalks at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. It's not so crowded in this photograph, but it is on a nice Saturday afternoon in the summer. Anyone who stops to take a picture or to tie his shoelaces creates an instant traffic jam. Floor-to-ceiling windows now flank the park, like partitions in a zoo. Park visitors and apartment dwellers stare at each other through the glass, and it's never clear which of the two is on display for the other. The final section, which opened just recently, preserves temporarily some of the wilderness that Sternfeld photographed. But since the soil is toxic, that overgrown strip sits behind a fence. In effect, it's a weedy diorama of the Highline's recent history. The preservation of the Highline has created an extraordinary anthology of early 21st century architecture. There are new buildings by Polshek, Jean Nouvel, Frank Gehry, Neil Denari, which is this one, Annabelle Seldorf, Shigeru Ban, Morris Ajmi, many others. The festival of construction continues, with more buildings on the horizon by Norman Foster, Zaha Hadid, Suchan, Thomas Yule Hansen. Have I left anybody out? Oh yes, Hudson Yards. Instead of landing in the middle of the bleakest part of Manhattan, the Highline will soon terminate at Hudson Yards, an immense forest of skyscrapers, public spaces, and a shopping center 5 times the size of the Time Warner Center, which is being developed by the same real estate company related. Preserving a useless strip of rusting railroad wound up creating billions of dollars in real estate. And it also forged an emblem of the new New York. It was also a part of a much broader social change. The decision to landmark the Gansevoort Market district came down in September 2003, and it effectively sealed the neighborhood's transition from gritty, gay sexual frontier to epicenter of capital-driven urbanism. 2 months later, a Massachusetts appellate court legalized same-sex marriage. That decision sealed the gay movement's transition from sexualized counterculture to a wholehearted embrace of convention and wedding registries. I'm not claiming a causal relationship, but the parallel makes it clear that the preservation of the Highline was inseparable from powerful economic and social transformations. So, what is the moral of these 3 preservation parables? One steered by an elected official, another by a billionaire, and a third by citizen activists. It's that preservation is a volatile force. To restore a building or a city street, or to keep it from being demolished, it's not just an exercise in nostalgia. It's a form of active engagement with the present, and it shapes the future just as profoundly as new architecture and construction does. I draw 2 related conclusions from this. The first is that preservation and planning are joined at the hip. James Marsden Fitch, for whom the Fitch Foundation is named, helped found what we now know as the Columbia School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning. 3 disciplines, 1 school. New York City, on the other hand, has a Department of City Planning and a Landmarks and Preservation Commission and various other completely independent bureaucracies that divide up architecture and urbanism among them. Wouldn't it make more sense to bring these disciplines into the same room so they could talk to each other? The second conclusion I draw is that preservationists cannot afford to be anti-development, the way, say, Isaac Stern was. Because, after all, preservation is development. Thank you.